Ah, Hello everyone. Today, I'd like to talk about our research on sequential recommendation using multi-domain data. Here's the presentation outline. First, I will briefly explain the recommender system. Next, I will discuss the motivation behind our research. Then I will introduce our method, and finally, I will present the experimental results and conclusion. Sequential recommender system recommends the next preferable item based on the user's action sequence. To be specific, in a latent space, the representations of the sequence and the next item are optimized to be close to each other. In the recommendation stage, the system searches the item representations similar to the input sequence representation. However, the user feedback data is often sparse compared to the number of items, which is a long-standing problem in training recommender system. A multi-domain recommender system can address this problem by integrating a user's diverse interests and activities. Recent multi-domain recommender system design the domain-shared and domain-specific view. The domain-shared view is represented by a domain-shared encoder, which is trained using data from all domains. The domain-specific view is represented by a domain-specific encoder, which is trained using data specific to a certain domain. Likewise, in a sequential recommender system, the domain-shared sequential encoder is trained on all sequences, including mixed domain sequences, which is to capture the domain-shared sequential preference. Also, the domain-specific encoder is trained on domain-specific sequences, which is to capture the domain-specific sequential preference. Then the system makes recommendation by combining the two preference scores. Now, I will discuss the motivation behind our research. To be specific, I will present the hypothesis, a brief experimental observation, and the main idea of our research. We believe that the previous approach of modeling both domain-specific and domain-shared view has potential limitations. Our hypothesis is as follows. When target domain interactions are neither sufficient nor recent, the model couldn't properly capture the domain-specific preference. This is because in such case, a domain-specific view depends on limited and outdated information in the input. In addition, a domain-specific view can't be utilized when target domain interactions are absent. To validate our hypothesis, we compared two different approaches using same neural network backbone. First approach is that use only the domain-shared view, and second approach is that use both the domain-shared and specific views. We tested NDCG performance for users whose target domain interactions are neither sufficient nor recent. We observed that domain-specific view does not improve the recommendation performance. This indicates that a domain-specific view is not informative when the sequential context in the target domain is limited and outdated. Let me explain our main idea. Our idea is to treat the mixed domain sequences as if they were domain-specific sequences. To do this, we need to extract and represent the target domain information from the cross-domain context in the sequence. We call this process adaptation. Through adaptation, the insufficient target domain context is supplemented, which makes a more context-rich input for a domain-specific view. Now I will explain our method in three parts. The first part is the domain space. The domain space is the latent space for representing items corresponding to a certain domain and for learning characteristics of each domain. The second part is the adaptation. Adaptation is the concept of transforming representation from one domain space into representation in another domain space. This process compensates for differences between domains and enables to align the representation in different domains with the representation in the target domain. The last part is optimization. In our study, we present tool loss functions for optimization that aim to learn domain-specific preference. Let me explain method overview with this figure. Specifically, I will explain the meaning of the color and arrow lines and the dotted arrow lines. First, we can see the different colors. Each color means a different domain space. In this figure, the red color signifies the target domain, and three domain spaces and one unified space are represented. The second, we can see the arrow line. The arrow lines show how representation from each domain space are adapted to the target domain space. This figure shows the two types of arrow lines. The first, the blue arrow line represents the adaptation that transform item representation from each domain space to the target domain space. Second, the green arrow lines here represent the augmented adaptation path, which additionally involves the sequential encoder in the middle of the adaptation path. These distinct adaptation paths provide two different domain-specific views. Last, we can see the dotted arrow line here. The dotted arrow line shows the optimization process. As shown in the figure, there are two types of arrow lines. In our study, the black dotted arrow lines is called the recommendation loss. It makes sequence representation and next adaptive representation similar in a target domain space, and the red dotted arrow line is called knowledge exchange loss. It maximizes similarity between the two different views guided by the different adaptation paths. In the following slide, I will explain the training process and each part of the method in detail. The first step of training is to obtain item representation from given sequences. To ensure that each item representation captures domain-specific feature, we derive item representation through domain-specific graph. Here, in our study, we employed lightweight graph convolution with domain-specific item transition graph. And in our method, the model samples the target domain to adapt based on the sampling probability. The sampling probability is designed to more frequently sample domains that are observed by the user and have a higher loss during the training process. After the target domain space is sampled, item representation are adapted to the target domain space. And the first step involves transferring item representation from each domain space to a unified bottleneck space through a domain-specific adaptation encoder. The unified bottleneck space has a smaller dimension compared to the domain spaces. This aim to filter out the detailed information of cross-domain, which reflects that the information across domain is usually partially shared. And the second step involves transferring item representation from unified bottleneck space to the target domain space through the domain-specific adaptation decoder. Through this process, the item representations are re-expressed in a specific domain. After the item representations are aligned in the sampled domain space, the sequence representation is encoded by the domain-specific sequential encoder. Given the representation within the sampled domain, minimize the recommendation loss, defined as the negative log likelihood to capture the domain-specific preference. Now I will explain the augmented sequence representation generated from the augmented adaptation path. As I mentioned earlier, a sequential encoder is located in the middle of the augmented adaptation path. This sequential encoder captures the comprehensive sequential information shared across domains in the unified bottleneck space, and the adaptation decoder adapts this information for the target domain at the sequence level. Therefore, it can provide a complementary perspective during the learning process. Here, I will explain the knowledge exchange laws, which facilitates the exchange of the knowledge between the two views. Conceptually, the augmented view mimics the original view by predicting the next item and the preference of the original view. So we can consider this concept as a form of online self-distillation. So in this section, I will explain the main experimental result. We conducted experiments by grouping 5 related domains together, and another set of experiments by grouping 3 different related domains together. We compared the four baseline groups. The first group is the CF group, meaning collaborative filtering, and the second group is the MDR group, meaning the multi-domain recommendation, and third group is SR group, meaning sequential recommendation, and last group is the MDSR group, meaning multi-domain sequential recommendation. And all baseline groups were trained on the multi-domain data. The values in each column represent the recommendation performance of a specific method, and the best value highlighted in bold. Firstly, we can observe that the SR group and MDSR group generally show superior performance compared to the other groups. Specifically, the SR group outperforms the CF group, and the MDSR group outperforms the MDR group. This tendency is pronounced in the first experiment. This implies that effective modeling of sequential context is crucial for improving performance. Secondly, we can observe that the MDR group and MDSR group generally show the superior performance compared to the other groups. Specifically, the MDR group outperforms the CF group, and the MDSR group outperforms the SR group. This tendency is pronounced in the second experiment. This implies that effective modeling of domain context is crucial for improving the recommendation performance. Okay. Lastly, we can see the proposed method shows the best performance in most cases. In short, this implies that proposed method effectively captures both the sequential context and also the domain context. Finally, let me conclude. We have discussed the multi-domain sequential recommendation, and to this end, we propose the concept of domain-based learning, which exploits the cross-domain context via adaptation. We hope our research will contribute for the future study in multi-domain sequential recommendation. This is end of my presentation, and thank you for listening.